Pleased to be introducing Jason Gibbs, our May speaker. He's an associate professor in Canada's only Department of Entomology at the University of Manitoba. He is an insect taxonomist who specializes in wild bees. He received his PhD at York University and both his master's and BSc at the University of Toronto. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed papers on various aspects of bee anatomy, ecology, evolution, and behavior. He recently published the most comprehensive list of Manitoba's bee fauna, documenting greater than 390 species in the province. I was asking him earlier if he would stay around and look at all the pictures on our phones that we all have of various bee things, and he could identify them for us. We could do a little fundraiser of some kind, I don't know. But
is there an easy way to frame that better on the screen? There's quite a bit of it missing off the bottom.
In recognition of his
Thank you.
contributions to bee taxonomy, 4 species have been named after him. So please join me in welcoming Jason Gibbs to be our speaker.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to be invited. Although my research is all focused on wild bees or native bees, my father was actually a commercial beekeeper in Ontario, so I've been around bees my whole life. So honeybees I have a soft spot for. And I don't always, so I'm going to talk a little bit about trying to support native bees with native plants, but I thought I would introduce native bees a little bit first before I talk about plants. I'm more of a bee person than a plant person, so I prefer that order. Normally I wasn't sure about this crowd giving them this quiz. I usually like to start asking people, how many bees do they see in this picture? Does anybody, feel free to shout out a number if you have any guesses.
Bees or wasps?
Bees? Bees. 3, 6, 4, a bunch of different numbers. And I'll tell you what I think is the answer. The answer is 2. That's the first one. And then the second one is this thing down in the corner. That's a bee. All of the rest of those are flies. But amazing, right? Some of these flies are amazing mimics, and there's no wonder they want to look like bees, because bees are really cool. But most bees are nothing like a honeybee. So everything that you know about honeybees, you can pretty much throw out the door, because it's not going to be true of all the native bees that we have. Whoa. So this, of course, is a honeybee. And then this little girl right here, this is a sweat bee, and this is the group of bees that I actually did my PhD on.
Just hang on a second.
Of course. Okay. So a lot of sweat bees actually are social in a way similar to honeybees. So they actually do have queens and workers, but the colony sizes are much smaller. Sometimes the colony might only be 1 worker on average. Sometimes on the larger scale, they could be dozens or even hundreds, but nowhere near the scale of a honeybee hive. Most bees are actually solitary, so it's a single female, constructs a nest, provisions brood, and lays her eggs, and maybe that's half a dozen to a dozen. Sorry about the sound. And they are mass provisioners. So they are collecting a ball of pollen, mixing with nectar, sometimes floral oils, laying a single egg on it, and then enclosing that cell. And for the most part, they have no more interaction with their offspring. So they're not feeding them with hypopharyngeal glands or anything like that. It's very different. They may aggregate, even solitary bees. So this is a photograph I took in Winnipeg, just a block from my house. These are solitary minor bees and there were several nests sort of in a location. So they can be quite abundant even when they're solitary in a single location. So most bees nest in the ground. So there's about 20,000 species of bees globally, and of the ones that make nests, and we'll get to that maybe in a second, 70% of them are estimated to nest in the ground. So that's just a solitary bee emerging out of its nest. And this is kind of what a bee nest looks like. This is a solitary bee. She's got a load of pollen on her legs. She carries them on something that we call a scopa, not a corbicula. A corbicula is just kind of an open space surrounded by hairs, but a scopa is just an abundance of hairs. And the pollen is carried, for the most part, dry, not wet like a honeybee. So she's sort of flying into her nest site. She's memorized where it is. She does sort of a flight for memorized landmarks. She lands on the ground, and then she scurries over to the left near that little piece of vegetation, and then she's gone. And that's what a bee nest often looks like. They're extremely hard to find. So anytime you find a bee nest, a solitary bee nest in the ground, send me an email. I might be interested. I might come and dig up your lawn. Very hard to come by. But I said 70% of bees that nest live in the ground, but there's also the rest of the bees don't make nests at all. They're what we call cuckoo bees, named after the cuckoo bird. They lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. And so they don't have pollen collecting structures at all. They don't have any nest building structures associated with them. And this is an example. This is a leafcutter bee cuckoo. So it goes into the nest of leafcutter bees and lays its eggs. They tend to be a little bit more wasp-like or very armored because they sometimes have to have these aggressive interactions with the host, and they have to win those fights. So the bees that don't nest in the ground most often nest in stems or any other sort of pre-existing cavities. It could be a beetle burrow in an old log. And this is kind of what the inside of their nest looks like. This is a mason bee nest up here. And so there's just, the individual cells are just partitioned by mud that the female collects. And so she makes this little disc, collects pollen and nectar, lays an egg on top, and then seals it with another disc of mud, and then proceeds in a linear fashion. And that's sort of an incomplete cell right there. She'll then cap it with mud to close the nest. This is a leafcutter bee nest. So in this case, each individual cell is made out of a cylinder of leaves. It might take 30 or 40 leaves to make an entire cell, and they use circular leaf pieces to cap those individual cells. So inside each, it's kind of hard to see, but this is sort of one that's kind of come up perpendicular, but there's several sort of nests, and they're sort of just sort of on top of each other. This is actually a wasp nest on the bottom. It's called a grass-carrying wasp. We don't actually have those in Manitoba. And so that's what the inside of a developing pupa looks like. This is actually what's known as a carpenter bee. We also don't have these. I took this picture in Arizona, but you can sort of see, in this case, these partitions are actually made out of wood chips. So this carpenter bees excavate holes in wood. They don't use pre-existing cavities. And then, in this case, whoops, these are just the developing pupa ready to molt into adults. But they'll also nest in pretty much any kind of cavity you can give them. So oftentimes this makes them very amenable to sort of artificial nests. You can drill a hole in a block of wood, and sometimes those will be occupied by bees. This is the blue orchard bee. This is one of the more common bees that's actually managed, particularly on the west coast for orchard crops. So people will get the cocoons. You can sort of open the nest, get the cocoons. They're fairly robust. They're basically mature adults, basically, by the end of the fall. And so you can rinse them off, wash them in some light bleach solution to kill any parasites, and then put them in a fridge or freezer for the winter, and then release them into whatever orchard that you want. And they're very effective pollinators per visit relative to honeybees. This is just the life stage of sort of a solitary bee. So we have our sort of ball of pollen with an egg on it. and then that egg will hatch, and then you have an early larva. That's all the food that she gets until she sort of is a late stage larva, and then she'll turn into a pupa. Many bees are generalists. Honeybees are hypergeneralists. They visit just about anything. And bumblebees are also highly generalized species. So pretty much any plant that you plant is going to benefit these sorts of hypergeneralist bees. A lot of those social sweat bees are also very generalist because they have to be able to use flowers from the very early spring all the way through colony development until the fall. And so, like honeybees, they're very generalist. So anything that is producing pollen and nectar is going to be good for those sort of generalist bees. This is all the same species of bumblebee, and it's just sort of showing you some of the different flower colors and morphologies that this bumblebee uses. But other bees, and these are kind of the more interesting bees I want to talk a little bit about, are highly specialized. In the scientific jargon, we kind of call these oligolectic bees, which is just they're foraging on a very limited number of options. So sometimes it's within a family, sometimes it's within a genus of plants, or sometimes they'll visit two kind of genera of plants that maybe are not that closely related. So each one of these are all bees that we have. All these photographs are from Manitoba. And so each one of these is specialized on a different sort of plant species. This is one also a specialist bee, and this is not a Manitoban bee, but I just like the picture. This is a specialist bee from, I took a photograph in Arizona, and it's a specialist on solanum. And this bee only forages very early in the morning. As soon as the sun is up and above the horizon, it's too late. So this was taken at like 5 in the morning. And it's a buzz pollinator. So this is a behavior that some wild bees have that honeybees don't have. So she's kind of grabbing the anthers of this solanum plant, and the pollen is deep within that anther tube, and you have to vibrate it to get the pollen in. And so she's rapidly sort of moving her wing muscles without moving her wings, and then sort of spreading the pollen down, as you can sort of see on her back legs. I don't know why I put this photo in other than that it's a nice picture of a sweat bee, but a lot of native bees are also robbing flowers as well. So you can see this little sweat bee has decided that it's going to get to the nectaries completely missing the pollen structures. And so a lot of bees, it just sort of highlights the fact that a lot, bees aren't really interested in pollinating per se. They just want the rewards of the flowers, and sometimes they'll manipulate that. I mentioned brood parasites already, the cuckoo bees. And this is just sort of an example of some of the different types of cuckoo bees. So it's a behavior that's sort of evolved multiple times within the bees. So these are basically almost entirely sort of independent origins. This is a cellophane bee cuckoo, which attacks a very specific specialist bee that visits dahlia. This is a bumblebee cuckoo. This is another leafcutter bee cuckoo here. This are sometimes called blood bees because the abdomen's bright red, and they're primarily visiting some of these solitary miners bees or the sweat bees. And then this is sometimes called a nomad bee. Looks very waspy, but it is a bee. And they're primarily attacking these miner bees, solitary miner bees. So you can see quite a few of these in the springtime, because that's when these solitary miner bees are most abundant. And then this is a tiny little parasite that visits a very specialized, small little andrenae bee. So this is the checklist of bees that was referred to in the introduction. So we published this last year. So this was an effort of a number of students and colleagues. And we basically, I'm also a curator of the J.B. Wallace Harvey Ruffley Museum of Entomology at the university. And so we sort of went into the historical collection. We used all the students' more recent surveys, and we compiled all the list of bee species that we could find. Some of these had never been recorded in the province before, and then some of them had never been recorded in Canada before. And this is one of them. This is a cuckoo bee, and it's the only specimen ever collected in Canada. So when I started at the university in 2016, at the end of 2016, there was about 250 species of bee that had ever been documented for Manitoba, and we found over 390, so it was quite an increase. One of the interesting things about some of the cuckoo bees is that they have these sort of specialized larval forms. So in this case, they have these early instar larvae that have these enormous mandibles. And so whenever they use those to sort of look around and find the larva of the host bee and kill it. And then after that, on the next molt, the next sort of instar, their mandibles become normal again, and then they feed on the pollen and nectar. So not everything that bees does is nice. And this is sort of an interesting example from the tropics. There's actually a few species of bees that are obligately necrophagous. So they, or necrophagous, they actually go and sort of hunt carrion and sort of bring that and feed their brood. So these are also sort of highly social, much the way that honeybees are. And they do produce honey, but you probably wouldn't want to eat their honey that these bees make.
Dead honey.
Yeah. And bees use other sorts of sources for nutrients. So the sweat bees get their name because they actually drink sweat. So on a hot summer day, you may have had the experience of a little bee landing on you and drinking your sweat. And if you're unlucky, you might get a little sting from them. But they'll also drink tears. These are tropical bees in the genus Centris, drinking sort of tears from a crocodile and a turtle. And there's some stingless bees up here and some flies drinking the tears of an unusual person. But yeah, this is someone taking a picture of themselves having their eyes drunk. Entomologists are an interesting sort. From a conservation standpoint, we actually don't know that much about how most bees are doing. Our recent sort of checklist expanded the list of bees known from the province by about 100. So if you ask the question, how are those bees doing, before we made that checklist, it would have been impossible to even ask the question because we didn't know they were here, let alone how they were doing. And so the museum collections help give us that sort of historical sort of perspective. It's kind of like having a time machine. We can kind of go back and say, okay, when people were collecting 100 years ago, what were they finding? And is that different from what we find now? And that's kind of the only real way that we have for sort of detecting these sorts of declines in most species. And people have found that for certain species, the declines are very obvious. The really famous example in Canada is probably the rusty-patched bumblebee in Ontario, which just kind of barely gets into Canada. It's more widespread in the United States in the East. And around the year 2000, it went from being maybe the third or fourth most common bee in the eastern US to virtually undetectable. And it's only known from a couple of locations, mostly in Minnesota, Iowa. You can still find it. And it hasn't been seen in Canada, I think, since 2009. This is kind of a contrary example. This is Bombus bimaculatus, and this is the range for Canada from a study in 1988. And this is its current range based on photographs on the iNaturalist website. And it's not because people weren't looking at this time. So in this same paper from 1988, there's all kinds of bumblebee records from Northern Ontario for other species. So they were looking at bumblebees in this area, but it just wasn't there. It didn't make it past the Northern Great Lakes. And now, if you go out in Winnipeg and look at a bumblebee, there's a pretty decent chance it's Bombus bimaculatus. They're really common in the city. And it makes it all the way into Saskatchewan as well. So this species has expanded its range for whatever reason. We don't really know why. But this is other species are a conservation concern. This is another one you can sort of find in Winnipeg pretty reliably. This is Bombus terricola. But in the United States, its range has contracted dramatically. So this is a paper from several years ago, but this was looking at historical data and sort of recent sort of surveys. And so these little yellow circles basically are historical records of where these bees were. And when there's sort of a dark orange part of the pie, that represents the modern sort of records. And the size of the circle is an indication of how many bees were collected. So for Bombus bimaculatus over here, there's lots of historical data, lots of recent collections. It's doing fine, at least through most of its range. But Bombus terricola is basically almost entirely extirpated from the United States. But you can still find it in Winnipeg. But that's a species of conservation concern. You may have seen something along the lines of this. I think this is kind of a bit of an exaggeration. I think if all the bees died, we would just be eating a lot more wheat and paying a lot more for our apples. So I'm really going to focus, this is sort of usually what the instructions I give to people is give them a place to live, give them something to eat, and try not to kill them, which basically don't use pesticides. But I'm going to kind of focus on the feed 'em aspect for this talk. This is the sort of thing that we don't like to see. Green grass, not much for bees, not even a place really for bees to nest. It's so densely packed. All those solitary bees nesting in the ground like some bare earth. This is the kind of habitats that I like to go to. This is spruce woods. Great place if you want to catch lots of interesting native bees. A lot of the species that we found for the first time in the province or Canada were from Spruce Woods Provincial Park. Lots of interesting flowers, lots of sandy habitat, great for ground nesting bees. This is also a great place. This was a nature preserve in Lansing, Michigan. I used to live in Michigan. And it's just like a trail they sort of mowed through this sort of old pasture. But there's lots of sort of bare patches of sandy soil, some flowers in the area. And this was, all my gear is here because this was just this nesting aggregation of leafcutter bees. So the alfalfa leafcutter bee you might have heard of is nested in cavities, but a lot of the leafcutter bees we have actually are ground nesters. And they nest about an inch under the ground, so they're right under the surface. I didn't actually know that when I took this picture. So one strategy for digging up bee nests is you dig a big hole and then you kind of come at it from the side. So I dug a hole about a foot deep, and then I started trying to chip away to find to trace the nest, and it was right there. It was a waste of time. But lots of bees, and you would never notice. I went to this park, I saw one female. I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I went back the next week, and it was just humming with activity. You could see them all excavating their nests, pulling dirt out of the ground, dropping it off, going back in. A week after that, you could just kind of see the occasional female kind of coming in, with pieces of leaves, provisioning their nest. And then the next week, they were all gone. You never knew it was there. So probably hundreds and hundreds of people every year just walked over this and never knew there was a bunch of bees under their feet. This is also great if you want to grow a garden. This is a great kind of pattern. Just big clumps of flowers. I'm really bad at this. I always just kind of want one of everything, and then I plant them, and it's terrible. You got to really have a nice big batch in a garden system. But anything helps. But this is one of the projects that we tried to do in Manitoba. We got funding from the Organic Science Cluster, and we tried to install a mix of annuals and tame perennials and sort of native perennials on these sort of big strips next to sort of agricultural fields as a way to help support pollinators, but also other sort of beneficial insects. This was by far the best one. They didn't all look like that, and they definitely don't all look like that now. But this is just sort of an example of what could be done with a little bit of effort. This wasn't that expensive, but it does take a certain amount of effort to sort of maintain. We planted this, and then there was 2 years of drought, and so we had some troubles. But my PhD student, working on this project, just found immediately you just have this big increase in the numbers of bees that you see, and also sort of predatory beetles and all sorts of other sort of beneficial insects that you want in a farm field.
Where is that?
We had sites kind of in in a circle all the way around kind of Winnipeg. So some were kind of northeast. This one was probably southwest, but I'm not entirely sure. So in terms of actually, native plants to support bees, first of all, we need plants blooming all year long. That's the critical thing that you really want to consider. And in the spring, it's mostly these sort of blooming trees and shrubs that are providing a lot of sort of resources for native bees. So a single sort of tree, a cherry tree, has this, thousands of blossoms, and it will just be absolutely buzzing with honeybees and native bees. This is a blue orchard bee. This is another one I photographed just a block from my house in Winnipeg with a cherry that was sort of in someone's lawn. My neighbors have started to get used to the fact that I'm sort of wandering around staring into their yards all the time. And this is other bees from the same cherry. So this is a miner bee, very common in the city. Kind of reddish hairs on the thorax and almost entirely black abdomen and black scopa. And this is a cuckoo that attacks this bee. So sometimes you can find the cuckoo bees on the same flowers that the host bee is on. But one of the really big ones, cherries, apples, serviceberry, all great for a wide variety of bees in the spring. But willow is really particularly special because there's a number of bees that are specialists on willows. Several species of miner bee only visit willows. So they'll fly over the cherry trees, they'll fly over the apples, they'll ignore the blueberries, and they'll only collect pollen from willow. There's a lot that we still need to learn about these. So I had a couple of undergraduates last year who went out to do some work. I sent them out to collect some bees from spring, in the springtime from willows and also from bearberry, just to kind of see what the differences in the communities were like and how maybe they sort of complemented one another. And they found a bee that's very well known to be a specialist on bearberries and blueberries, that sort of family, and they collected it on willow. And it was only collecting willow pollen. And so it kind of makes us kind of question what we know about that species. Is it really a blueberry specialist, or just it prefers blueberry, but in a pinch it'll use whatever it can get? And there's a lot of questions like that we don't really know the answers to. And so that's the fun part about my job, is that I get to send students, I don't get to do this myself anymore, I get to send students out and they kind of find all kinds of interesting stuff, and then I take the credit afterwards. So this is blueberry, of course. This is a commercial blueberry crop, but blueberry also has a number of specialist bees. It's very important for bumblebees and sweat bees and all sorts of other sorts of species as well, but they're things like bearberry and blueberry are native species that have sort of been here for many years, thousands of years, and the bees have sort of adapted to only, we think, mostly, use that sort of pollen. And this is another, plant that has a very kind of specialized kind of anthers that sort of benefits from sort of buzz pollination as well. Another spring plant, which is an interesting one, is penstemon. So this right here is the best picture I could manage. This is Osmia distincta. This is a penstemon specialist bee that we have in Manitoba. And it has specialized hairs on its face. It has these sort of hairs that sort of go forward on its head, so that when it kind of climbs into this sort of long corolla of this penstemon, it can scrape the pollen off and then sort of transfer it onto the rest of its body. They're like leafcutter bees. They carry their pollen on the underside of their abdomen and not on their legs. But there's other spring bees like this Gibbs-RRAA, which are also prefer these sorts of kind of purplish, kind of blue flowers in the springtime. So that's a great plant as well. In the spring, how many people have heard of Nomome? Controversial in some ecological circles because it tends to promote dandelions, which are not a native plant, and people like native plants for native bees. I kind of take the perspective that any flower is better than no flower. But that's an option for people who want to sort of promote more than just a grass, is to kind of leave the flowers alone for a period of time. But if you have a cherry tree or an apple tree, it's not as important. Later on in the summer, sort of July is a really important time for me to go out and look for bees, because that's when things like prairie clovers are in bloom. And prairie clovers also have a number of specialist bees that only visit them. And this is just a few examples. These two kind of fuzzy bees are what we call cellophane bees or plasterer bees. And they line their cells of their nest with this glandular secretion from their abdomen that makes this sort of cellophane-like material. It's a polyester. And then they provision inside that. And their provisions are often much more liquid. And sometimes the larvae have special sort of expansions so they kind of float on the surface of the liquid. And then this is a little minor bee, kind of related to the one, distantly related to the one that I showed you before, but it also is a specialist on dahlia. And you can see they're all very pale. They kind of blend in with that sort of pale head of the dahlia, but also they tend to be in very sandy habitats. So when they're on the surface of the sand, it's very hard to find them. Some of these have specialized cuckoos that only attack them. So the plants are supporting the host, but it's also indirectly supporting the cuckoo bees. Campanula is another one. So these are both campanula sort of specialists. This is a cellophane bee. This is a leafcutter bee. This is another one that we were sort of novelly sort of recording from the province, and it has its own cuckoo, which you can also find. You can actually see these in Manitoba because they visit the creeping bellflower, which is sort of an exotic weed, but they'll use it. And so you can find both of these species in Winnipeg fairly regularly. Favorite that I have is yellow loosestrife. This is Lysomachia. This is Macropus nuda, and it's an oil collecting bee. So it has specialized hairs to collect floral oils from this loosestrife, which it sort of uses to line its cell, but also feed its offspring with the pollen and nectar. And it has its own cuckoo. And this cuckoo, there's two species in this genus. One is here, one is in Europe. They both attack Macropus. And this is one which people basically didn't see it for 70 years. This is the first kind of specimen that had been collected in Manitoba in 95 years. So someone collected it in like 1924 or something, and then we collected it in 2019. And so it's still present. And this is one of the only places, I think it might be the only places in Canada where people are semi-predictably know where to find this bee. The really big later season group of plants are the composite Asteraceae, things like sunflowers and relatives. Very abundant for a diverse group of bees. So there's two different kinds of bees here, a leafcutter bee and a little masked bee. But there's also a very large numbers of specialist bees on these composite flowers. Sunflowers in particular have a variety of bees. So these are specialized, these are a specialist, a male and a female on the sunflower. And this is actually most closely related to that small dahlia specialist bee. So that group has a lot of specialists. And then this is kind of more closely related to that Eucera that we saw in the penstemon. This is a Melisodes. Almost all Melisodes that we have are specialists on some kind of composite flower, and we have quite a few. And then goldenrods are really big. So this is a goldenrod specialist minor bee with really pale yellow hairs, kind of camouflaged. This is a cellophane bee that only visits goldenrod. Sometimes they'll also visit asters that are nearby. And this is another one of these. This is what's called a perdita. It's also the same genus as that sunflower one and the dahlia one as well. So that group is specialized, and they diversify, and they specialize on a bunch of different plants. And this is another little related to a minor bee that's also a specialist on composites. And I had a master's student who sort of worked on that group because I didn't know how to identify them, so I got a student to do it. But basically, all kinds of composites, gumweeds, have bees that sort of specialize on them in various groups. And so anytime I see a kind of composite flower, especially late in the summer, I'm looking at it because you'll never know what you're going to find. This is another, this one here is a Melisodes. This is, we think is Melisodes bidentis. And this is another sort of new provincial record, and I took that picture in kind of Wolseley in front of someone's lawn. So there's all kinds of interesting things that can be found even in the city. So this is just my list of bee plants that I sort of recognize as things that bees specialize on. And I won't go through them, but it's quite a list. Some bees are more kind of specialists almost at the family level, and then some are very specific on particular genera. But I'll just leave that because it's going to be on YouTube and people can pause. But the major contributors, I would say, are those sort of spring shrubs, trees, especially willow, and then these late season composites. And that will give you a very wide diversity of both sort of generalists supporting the sweat bees and the bumblebees, and also all these sorts of specialist bees. But there's a lot of different kinds of bees, plants that I don't have time, very specific one-to-one sort of relationships on different groups. And to summarize, basically, most bees don't sting. Those minor bees, you couldn't get them to sting you if you tried. Most of them are solitary, living in underground burrows. They're not black and yellow, although I put a black and yellow one there, that's a bad example. But they can be metallic bright green, they can be yellow and red, they can be blue, all kinds of colors. And almost none of them make honey. So bumblebees make, the 29 species of bumblebees that we have in the province make tiny amounts of honey, but you would never harvest it. And then the other 360 bees that we have don't make honey at all. And again, we don't know enough about them to really state clearly how they're doing. All we know is that a lot of habitat has been converted into agriculture, and that has come at the consequence of prairies and other sort of habitats that these bees would have been present, but we don't know whether or not they're stable or not. So this is just a quick summary of some of the major groups of bees that we have. So here's some ones that are bright green, black and red, pale yellow, black and yellow. This one is actually an exotic species from Europe that we sort of found in Winnipeg recently. And all kinds of interesting bees. Every single one of these has sort of its own sort of story to tell. And I could go on ad nauseum doing that if you like. But if you have any questions, I'll happy to answer them. Yes?
You mentioned, this is close to the beginning of your presentation, that this particular bee that you had up there would bring back its pollen dry compared to honeybees that bring it back wet. Can you expound on how it would be able to do that? Because it would almost be like a bee running around with a double handful of flowers.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some like hydrostatic connections, between the bees. The external sort of surface of the bee picks up kind of like, I want to say it's a negative charge when it's flying through the air. Yeah, and so in some cases you'll actually see the pollen jump slightly off the flower and connect to the bee, so it sort of sticks with the static charge. But if you look at some of the pollen, some of the hairs on these, the scopa, where they carry the pollen, there's actually all kinds of different sort of variation that you see in the structure of those hairs, and some of them seem to be connected to them and like the structural properties of the pollen grains themselves. So if it's a really big, large pollen grain versus a very small pollen grain, the formation of the hairs might be different to accommodate that different pollen structure.
Now, second part is you said honeybee pollen, they're sort of wetting it.
Yeah,
I was under the impression that that same, what you just described, was how bumblebees were collecting their pollen.
It's true. Bumblebees are fairly closely related to.
Oh, sorry, honeybees.
Yeah, honeybees and bumblebees are actually pretty closely related. They're sometimes called the corbiculate apids. So stingless bees, which are in the tropics, the orchid bees, which are in the tropics, honeybees and bumblebees, all have the same kind of structure on their hind legs, the corbicula for carrying pollen. and they'll mix it with pollen, with nectar to make it kind of a wet mass, and that's sort of fixed there. And then most bees have that sort of dry pollen. There's some, like the little perdita that I kind of pointed out, they have kind of an interesting behavior in that they actually will collect a small amount of pollen on the underside of their thorax. And I may have a picture somewhere, but you can sometimes see them rising up from like the dahlia plant or whatever it is. They kind of rise up on their back legs, and then they've sort of stored the pollen on the underside of the thorax, and they kind of go like this. They kind of mix it with nectar really rapidly and then move it back to their back legs. And then so they actually have kind of a wet mass on their back legs, which kind of gets really big. And if you look at the scopa, it's very sparsely haired, but they're sort of holding it together with this sort of nectar. And there's one group of bees, the masked bees, which actually carry the pollen back to their nest in their crop. They don't have any pollen collecting structures at all. They just have a specialized crop, and they carry it back and regurgitate it. Yeah.
Have you ever found a mite on any of the wild stock?
Lots. Not varroa mites, but they have all kinds of different kinds of mites. Some of them are actually good mites. There's certain groups of bees, carpenter bees will have this, and certain groups of sweat bees have this. They have what's called a canarium. It's a specialized structure specifically designed, evolved for carrying mites. So in certain kinds of carpenter bees, it's this kind of a cavity on the front part of the metazoma, the abdomen, and that the mites go inside. Other cases, there's specialized hairs between the kind of the mesosoma and the metazoma where the mites are stored. And the logic there is that those mites are fungal feeders. So they bring them back to the nest, and then the mites are in there and they're feeding on all the things that would otherwise spoil the provisions. But then there's also, of course, mites that go in and feed on pollen that sort of hitch a ride, and they're sort of negative. Let's see.
How far do they fly to forage? Are they like the honeybee or similar?
Generally not as flying as far as the honeybee. In an extreme case, there's, I was collecting bees in Chile, a group that my PhD advisor studied, and they will nest in the stems of a particular plant called Nolana. And this is kind of in the Atacama, so they're basically, you can sort of predict where the plant is because it's just where the kind of wash is by the side of the road. So you can get a mile marker and say, stop at this mile marker, get off, and there'll be a plant there, and then the bees are nesting in the plant and foraging on the plant. So they have a foraging range of about this. That's the extreme. Typical bee, you'd probably say they're probably flying a couple 100 meters on average, up to maybe 1 kilometer. But it gets pretty extreme for a native bee to be flying much farther than that. But then there are some of these really large the bigger the bee, the farther it can fly. So bumblebees can probably easily fly a couple of kilometers if they have to.
I noticed in one of your previous slides earlier on, when you talked about conservation of the bee, say to feed them and to grow flowers, but on that slide it also said bees and wasps.
Oh, did it? Well, yeah, wasps are great.
So you want to feed the wasps?
I mean, wasps kind of feed themselves to a large extent, but sometimes you'll see these sort of what people call bee hotels. Sometimes, basically just holes drilled in wood or some stems for some of these cavity nesting bees. Oftentimes, the ones that you might go into a big box store and buy aren't very good because the stems are too wide, they're too short. What you really want is something that's going to be at least 15 centimeters long, with the diameters anywhere from like 3.5 to 8 millimeters in diameter. And that's the typical range that most bees and wasps will use. But you'll often, if you put up one of these and you're successful, you'll sometimes see some mud caps And more often than not, those are solitary wasps. But they're out there sort of feeding on crickets or caterpillars that might be otherwise be eating your trees or your shrubs or your plants. Native wasps, yeah, for the most part, yeah. And solitary, so they're not aggressive like the yellow jackets that people might be used to.
You said around my place, I most commonly see in the bumblebees, what I understand is called the tricolor bumblebee. Is that remarkable in any way? Are they fairly common around here?
It should be Bombus turnarius, I think is what, common names always kind of get me, but there's, the two ones that you sometimes see with red on are Bombus rufocinctus, which I think is the red belted, and then Bombus turnarius, which is the tricolored. And they're both relatively abundant. I don't know if there's anything particularly notable about, other than it's one of our more common bumblebees, so fairly northern sort of distribution. But I mean, bumblebees sort of vary a little bit as well in terms of some of their, some bumblebees come out a little bit earlier, some bumblebees come out a little bit later. There seems to be evidence that, that they're maybe using a slightly different complement of flowers. There are what we call, Bombus turnarius is what I call a short-tongued bumblebee. It's got a very short face, and then things like Bombus bimaculatus, for example, have a fairly long face, and that kind of accommodates a longer tongue because the tongue kind of folds up inside the head. And so they'll probably use slightly different make slightly different choices in terms of what flowers they're using in the environment.
You're not shy about stealing a bit of honey, but 80%, I know that.
Yeah, and sometimes I've seen bumblebee nests where you can see things like hive beetles go in and attack bumblebees as well.
Do you have any information on light pollution and the effects on wild bees or something like that?
That's an interesting question. I don't have anything specific to about that. I mean, the more light there is, the longer the bees will forage. So, if you were up in Churchill, they'll be foraging for longer periods than they will here. And sometimes I'll see bumblebees, flying around at 9 p.m. because the light sun's still up. But I've never really seen bees out really once the sun is down. I've never seen a case where there's like so much light out that the bees are changing their behavior in that way. Probably during the eclipse, they kind of went, "What?" and stopped. And then, after a few minutes later, started foraging again. But light pollution is traditionally considered more of a problem for some of these nocturnal insects, like moths and stuff. They just kind of might change. They might be, coming in from large distances and getting kind of stuck or killed. Yeah.
Do you have any comments on the impact of honeybee population on
I have lots of thoughts. Yeah. So as I carefully mentioned at the beginning, my father was a commercial beekeeper in Ontario, so I have a soft spot. Favorite sort of breakfast food of myself and my sons is sort of honey toast in the morning. So I don't want the honeybees to be gone. But there's a number of different ways theoretically that honeybees can sort of interfere with native bees. One is just sort of taking pollen out of the system. So if the native bee goes to a flower and says, "Oh, a beautiful flower," and it goes and like all the pollen and nectar is gone because the honeybees have been there first, that's a problem. And then sometimes you'll see the native bees will be on a plant and then a honeybee will come in and the native bee will get scarce. So there might be some sort of kind of competition. Probably mostly with bumblebees because they're more closely related, but there's some definitely sort of cases of things like deformed wing virus and things like that kind of getting into the other species of bees. How problematic it is kind of unclear. People are sort of working on that. Like, you can detect it in a native bee, but whether or not that's actually causing detrimental effects is unclear. So various people have sort of looked at this question in various ways, and the usual answers are either somewhat negative or neutral, is what honeybees are for raw bees. I guess the other thing that honeybees can do is sometimes they'll preferentially visit flowers that aren't native. So they might really help the reproduction of plants that might not be very good for the environment or wild bees. So yeah, there's lots of different mechanisms that are maybe at play. So, but I like to eat honey. Yeah, I mean chickens aren't native either, and you know, there's lots of plants that aren't native, soybeans. So we have to sort of make compromises. Yep.
Not really to corral you into a corner about whether honeybees are detrimental to wild pollinators. And I agree with your position that probably a little at least. I was part of the drive to help establish urban beekeeping in Winnipeg. Chris Kerouac Bee Project and his efforts were incredibly instrumental. And now I kind of feel like, oh, whoops. Because like I run a bumblebee rescue. I do private consults for preserving wild pollinators, sort of as a guilt reflex. As well,
it's okay, John.
I also want to be compared to, like when urban beekeeping came to Winnipeg, there was a pretty big influx, and you can kind of see that suddenly the University of Manitoba short beekeeping course was sold out and expanded, and our membership here surged. And then as people realized that beekeeping isn't all beer and chocolate, those numbers trailed down, and now it's sort of stable. It's definitely a hobby and it's established. And there's the pros we've also seen for wild pollinators is the fact that automatically a registered urban beekeeper, there's a no spray zone attached to that, and so perhaps that gives a bit. But my main question is compared to other impacts of wild pollinators, which is monofloral planting or tilling every acre possible, even into the ditches, like, you know, would it be in the top 3 or top 5 or number 1 threat to wild pollinators?
No, I mean, I would say habitat loss is far and away number 1. You just can't convert, 1,000 acres to soybean from a tall grass prairie and expect that to not have an impact. So I think that's kind of the big historical and to an extent still continuing sort of issue. Associated with that, you'll get pesticides that are all, obviously going to be impacting bees and other insects. Climate change is probably the next big one that's sort of emerging as a factor. But yeah, honeybees are not necessarily in my top 3. The thing that I often do when I'm talking to people about sort of the urban beekeeping kind of case is I actually take the perspective of the honeybee. So, if you're interested in honeybees and you want to save the bees, probably the worst thing to do is start a hobby beekeeping operation. And if you're going to take the beekeeping course for sure, but you don't want to manage those honeybees poorly, because then they're just a reservoir for pathogens and parasites, and you're just making it harder for the people who are trying to do it professionally. So that's my perspective on the urban bee. Like, think about it very carefully, make sure that you're well educated so that if you do it, you're doing it well for the honeybees.
I have pollinator-friendly planting lists for gardeners, because I believe that more people that put out nectar-bearing plants, build it, they will come, so to speak. But
Yep.
after your presentation here, I'm wondering if I'm missing some key ones that could be added to those lists, because I don't want to just be disseminating information or, hey, plant this is great, and I'm missing out on good chunk of the species. So do you have any lists of?
There's, I'm trying to remember the exact name of the website, but there's like the Be Better Manitoba or something. There's the Rob Curry and Sarah Semler were involved in putting together a website for sort of for bees in Manitoba. And I think it's something like Be Better Manitoba or something. Yeah. And they have floral lists there. The other go-to that I will have is the Xerces Society, which is I think is xerces.org or something, and they have sort of regional lists, and also other sorts of like how to build a pollinator habitat or how to build a bee hotel. They have kind of sometimes free documents, and you can get one. It's probably mostly designed for like North Dakota and Minnesota, but you can sort of take that and sort of run with it. But there's also sources for pollinator lists. Yep.
There's also another impact, and that's forest fires and smoke, and that's lasting a bit too.
Yeah, the forest fires is kind of an interesting one because in some ways, I mean, it would be better if the fires were more regular, like they would have been historically, and not sort of these big, massive ones. Because because actually a lot of bees are sort of kind of early successional kind of disturbance responders. So you have a forest fire, all of a sudden you open up the canopy, you get a bunch of flowers blooming, and that's what the bees like. So on a really extreme level, it's probably not good, but local kind of small scale fires, bees are probably going to pop in and take over those sort of areas while they last. Yes?
Yeah, just still on the habitat creation string that we're talking about, you said you set up some areas around the city where you planted. You had a picture of the roadside with a bunch of different,
Those
all on there. There's thistles.
Those were more rural, like those were like kind of outside the city limits.
Did you actually create those from the ground up?
Yeah, we collaborated with some people from plant science. Yvonne Lawley in particular, she's a cover crop specialist. So she kind of really had the expertise and the lead for how to effectively get the plants in the ground. And so we sort of just kind of actually worked with people from the Xerces Society as well to sort of come up with what was a good list. And then I think it was Xerces who are working with Cheerios actually to put in pollinator habitat and imperial seeds. We sort of came up with a mix and we put that in. It's kind of a novel mix. So like in an ideal world, I would just put in all native tall grass prairie type plants, but that's very expensive. And a little harder potentially to convince sort of conventional sort of annual crop rotation people to sort of put this in. We wanted something that was fairly cheap, reliable, maybe temporary.
Okay, so it's not going to sustain itself?
It's not going to sustain itself without management. Yeah.
And when you had a mix designed and then you bought it and then you just spread it out, or was the ground prepared in any way?
The ground would have been prepared. It was spread. Actually, my colleague Yvonne Lawley is currently she's kind of going back a step, and she has some experimental plots at Glenlee and Carmen where she's trying different sort of approaches, broadcasting seed versus drilling seed, mowing at different times of year to try to see what kind of practices would be best to establish, annual, more sort of annuals, perennials, tame perennials. So she's got different seed mixes, different seeding approaches, different mowing timing to try to figure out which combination of that is best, so that then if we try this sort of experiment again, we can sort of do something that's going to be a little bit more effective, hopefully. But no one had really done this sort of experiment in the prairies before, so we kind of learned a lot by failing.
Is there a government program for willow plants available?
And I'm not aware of any.
We used to be able to get them from Indian Head
Oh,
as windrows.
the whole process is done.
So I guess, well, we really appreciate you coming out to speak to us tonight, and I think everyone's taking home lots of information, and I guess we should all give Jason a round of applause.
Thank you.